when you stop and look at the problem that MIT was facing and that you sketched with workers' pay and the atrophy of the middle class and middle income jobs in the country, there's a strand that says, well, this is all about money. Too many people are not earning enough money. Let's simply establish welfare programs that transfer money to people. That will solve the problem. We can tax the rich, take the money away, turn it over to other folks in one or another program, and that will do the job. You've written with your colleagues an entire book and an entire devoted to work and making work pay much better and support individuals' lives. Why is work important?
I think work is quite important. I think work isn't just the thing you do, that unpleasant thing you do for pay so you can go home and enjoy yourself. Work provides meaning, structure, identity, purpose, esteem. It provides a community. It hopefully provides, friends. It's part of the kind of productive project of many people's lives. That doesn't mean everyone should be compelled to work, but work is a good. Work is not a bad.
This is Wally Knox. Welcome to the Political Conversation. David Autor is the co-chair of the Department of Economics at MIT and is also the co-chair of MIT's task force on the work of the future, which is dedicated to, quote, exploring strategies for a future of shared prosperity, end quote. Autor is widely known for his pioneering studies of the China trade shock and of job polarization in America. For decades, he has been the indispensable economist concerned with the prosperity of the American worker. Economist magazine calls him the academic voice of the American worker. On a personal note, before graduate study, he spent 3 years directing computer skills education for economically disadvantaged children and adults. And Autor is the proud captain of the MIT economics hockey team. I got that off your website. Is that still the case?
We were on hiatus last year, but we hope to start again this fall. So yes.
Well, good luck to you.
And thank you for that nice introduction. And I'm not currently the associate head of my department, but I was, and I'll be the chair again in a few years.
Well, welcome to the political conversation.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
I've so been looking forward to getting into this with you. Focused on your new book, The Work of the Future, which comes right out of the task force. But I actually thought it would be interesting to sketch the fact that this is an MIT effort. Can you explain the genesis of the task force?
Sure. So really, the credit goes to MIT's president, now outgoing president, Rafael Reif. And Rafael felt very strongly that MIT is producing a lot of the technologies that people are very concerned about in terms of their implications for where the world is heading, especially the world of work, and that we ought to have something responsible and well-informed to say about what are the things that are happening, how concerned should we be about them, and if we are concerned, how do we kind of maximize the benefits and minimize the harms? What do we do to steer and shape the future? And so we call ourselves the Work of the Future Task Force to convey the idea that we're not asking a question of whether there is a future of work. We're asking about what that work will be. And in some sense, the work of the present we were trying to signal is kind of creating that future.
Well, I thought we'd dive straight then into the heart and substance of the book with two topics I wanted to explore with you initially, which follow the general outline of the book, and that is what is the problem that you and the MIT task force see with pay in the country? Different people explain it very differently, and what's your take on the pay problem? And then shift to what MIT and you see as the causal factors in that problem.
Sure. So an easy way to see the pay problem is, and this is a kind of a well-known set of facts portrayed in various places, that if you sort of trace the trajectory of three things over time, one of them being productivity, meaning kind of output per hour of work in the United States, the second being average pay, meaning how much, all the pay to all the workers divided by the number of workers. And the third being median pay, meaning the pay that 50% of people earn more than, 50% of people earn less than. Those three series, productivity, average pay, and median pay, rise in lockstep very rapidly, actually, from sort of the end of the Second World War to the mid-1970s. And there's a period of very strong productivity growth, but very evenly shared gains. After the mid-1970s, productivity growth is slower, but still pretty rapid. We're about 80% more productive per hour now than we were in 1973. The average grows almost as fast, but not as fast as productivity, meaning that means if it's growing less quickly, that labor's share of output is falling, more of it's going to capital. But the really startling thing in that series is that the median barely budges. It rises by about 11 percentage points between mid-1970s and around 2020. And so that means that although we're creating a lot more output, a lot of more things that could be shared, the typical worker is receiving very little of them. And why is that so? Well, another way of saying that is inequality has risen enormously, such that much of the gains are going to the top. And for people well below the median and people with high school or lower education, in many ways, the labor market has gotten worse than it was, especially for non-college men. Real earnings fell for quite a while and then kind of bounced along at the bottom. And so this is the pay problem as we see it, the lack of translation from a lot of economic growth into rising living standards for a large chunk of people. And we spend a lot of time in our report, our book, comparing ourselves to other industrialized economies. And almost every industrialized country has seen some of this divergence between the path of productivity and the path of the median, or between the average pay and the median pay. But the U.S. is an extreme outlier relative to other countries. And so what we take from that, and what we emphasize throughout the book, is that it's useful to look at the commonality and the diversity. The commonality is, look, all these countries, there was more equal growth between the Second World War and the 1970s than there has been over the last 4 decades. And all these countries are facing similar pressures that contribute to some of that. So they all face, rapid technological change, computerization, aging of the population, growing world integration, rising competition from China, pressures from immigration, and so on. And so it's not shocking that they have some things in common. And yet, the fact that they're so different, that the growth of inequality is so much greater in the United States than it is in Scandinavia, or than it is in France, for example, or in Germany, or almost anywhere else, tells you that there's a lot of institutional forces that matter very much as well. And so we should think simultaneously, on the one hand, some of these things are a result of technology and trade, and we have to, that those help steer the ship. But it's a mistake to believe that this is all the market. We have no influence over it. It's not a human creation, and it has to be this way. It doesn't.
So let me pause and go back to the history a bit, because you sketched the divergence of productivity growth from median income growth, which is a startling fact in history. You also examine in figure 2.2, if I remember correctly,
I don't know, so you could be making it up.
I could, but I'm not. You examined the educational levels and what's happened to paychecks in that regard. There were 2 striking features in those graphs for me. One feature was from the end of World War II to 1973, there was striking growth for every level of education: high school dropouts, high school graduates, college graduates, super graduates, blah, blah, blah. We all were growing, and growing largely in sync. And come 73, that came to a startlingly abrupt end, and a decline set in across the various things.
The decline starts around 1980. Right, so we sort of stagnate together from sort of 73 to 1980, and then 1980 there's this divergence where people with college or greater education see real earnings growth, and people with less than college see sharp earnings declines.
Right. So the reason I'm just sort of talking about that is it lends a context to the discussion that lifts it out of looking at 50 years of statistics and just comparing the end state with the beginning state. At the other thing that concerns me in that is a snap judgment that I hear all the time from folks is we really need to have much more graduation from college that will solve our various problems. And if the percentage of the population that graduates from college grows, we can grow our way out of this. But I'm looking at some of what your work reveals about college pay, and it looks to me like college pay has not exactly been thriving since the 1990s. What's your examination of that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the growth of higher earnings for higher educated workers is concentrated among people with post-college degree. Now, all those folks also have a college degree, but they're people with MBAs and PhDs. They're lawyers and they're doctors, engineers. So it is the case. It's not so. Wages for people with a pure four-year degree have basically been steady since about 2000, with some recent declines actually. So I don't think. So first of all, now partly, of course, you could say, look, many of the people, the fraction of people with a four-year degree who go on for a post-baccalaureate degree has risen a lot, right? So there's a big change in the composition. If you lump them together, it looks better. You could say some should be relabeled. But I think more broadly, it's a mistake to think that everybody needs a college education to succeed, or should need a college education to succeed in the economy. We don't need everybody to have a bachelor's degree. There's a lot of people doing a lot of work, right, in the trades, in construction, in transportation, in services, even in medical paraprofessions that don't require a college degree to do that job. And in fact, arguably many people who have college degrees are doing things that don't require a college degree to do that job. And it's in other industrialized nations, they have people with strong vocational educations often have a good middle class living. All through Western Europe, especially Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, they have excellent apprenticeship and kind of blue collar vocation tracks where people are very skilled. And if you're in the trades, if you're in manufacturing, if you're in a variety of skilled services, that's credentialed activity, and you can have a good middle class lifestyle without having to go on for a four-year college degree. And it's also notable. I said that the pay of the median worker has stagnated. The education of the median worker has not stagnated. The median worker in the United States is much more educated in 2020 than he or she was in 1979, and yet their pay has risen only a little bit. So it's just not sufficient. It's not that we shouldn't be sending people to college. We should. It's not that we shouldn't be investing in human capital. We should. But that's just kind of pushing on a rope at a certain point. Simple supply side solutions like that are not going to be sufficient.
So you start breaking the causal elements down into three large baskets: technology, globalization, trade, with a focus on China, and what you call institutional features of America's labor market, like the minimum wage, the stagnation of the minimum wage, unions, the lack of unionizations. Three large baskets. And I found your discussion of those baskets really interesting because there are very few people who would disagree about those three baskets as being the important causal agents to look at. But the take your book has a really interesting distinctive view of what's important to think about. Could we go topic by topic and talk about the technology aspect? Begin with the technology aspect. Just to be blunt, there's so much conventional wisdom that technology and automation is all about, I'm losing my job to whatever, an algorithm, a robot, some piece of machinery that comes along. So technology is an irrepressible force against my making a living. And you start pointing out some really interesting things about technology. Could you give us your assessment of that?
Sure. So, technology is, when those people think about technology, they think about exactly what you said, automation, right? There's something that used to be done by people, and now it's done by a machine. But there are also multiple other phases that are equally important. One is a lot of what technology does is it gives us better tools to do what we're doing, right? So if you're a doctor having diagnostic tools, if you're an architect having designing tools, if you're a roofer having access to a pneumatic nail gun, right? All these things, they don't replace you. They make your labor more valuable. You can do a better job. You can do more work. You can do better work, right? So technology in many cases is augmenting us. Think of the nightmare you would have if we took away your tools for your work, right? Additionally, technology also creates new demands for expertise and specialization that makes labor more valuable, right? So, whenever we have a new service or a new product, there's always new expertise that goes along with it. So, for example, the U.S. statistical agencies keep track of new and emerging work. And like some occupations you might see or new titles would include like a solar plumber or a solar electrician. So what is that? Well, it's a person who was a plumber or electrician, probably that's what they trained for. And they spent a lot of time working around solar installations. And of course, you develop expertise for that, right? If you're going to be putting in a solar plant or large installation in your neighborhood, you need an electrician, you need a plumber because there's water and electricity, but you'd prefer one who actually had done this before, right? So you turn to a solar plumber, a solar electrician. So we're constantly creating new demands for expertise. Some of it associated with technology, people who know how to work with different equipment machines. Some will create new services. So we should think of this process as being dynamic. It's not just technology is just taking away things and encroaching on what people do. It's simultaneously amplifying our productivity with the tools that it gives us and creating new needs, new specializations that make labor more valuable. That a lot of the value of labor comes from expertise, from being able to do something that others can't do. And a lot of what gives rise to that scarcity is the fact that circumstances are changing. Technology is part of that. Now, that doesn't mean that therefore don't worry about it. Everybody benefits. Everybody gets automated a bit and augmented a bit. That's not what I'm saying. There can be real winners and losers in this process, right? If you're a person who was, your expertise was in typesetting or medical transcription, or certain types of crafts that are no longer practiced, right? It's quite clear that automation can reduce the demand for your labor, reduce the value of the specialized skills that you possess. And other people simultaneously are finding new opportunities from those same sets of changes. So there may be no one who's at the average, no one who's simultaneously harmed and helped to the same degree. But it's the main point is that this dynamism is inevitable, it's continuous, and the challenge is to try to shape it and take advantage of it rather than simply say, well, all the technology is just going to harm us.
And in your discussion of that, one of the things I found remarkable was you really focused on job training and community colleges. And we're not talking continually about either K through 12 education or college education. The bulk of the book on what are we going to do about the technology issue dealt with really a much more robust, much more mature approach to technical and skills education. Would you address some of your views on that?
So, I think we have invested substantially and heavily in higher education, baccalaureate education. The U.S. is really pretty good at this. There are many inefficiencies, but overall we do that pretty well. Where we really fall down is in helping people to get skills and do skilled work that doesn't send them on the path through a liberal arts or technical education. And
now this harkens back to what you were saying just a moment ago about how different our country has been from other European nations in particular. So I interrupted you at that point, but I can hear echoes of everything you've been saying before.
Yeah. And there's plenty of work to do in these. So one reason to send all these people to college is you think, well, there just won't be any more of that other type of work to do. But we don't see that. In fact, we're entering a period of demographic shortage, of labor scarcity. And of course, we wrote this book before the pandemic, or as the pandemic was just underway. But of course, you can see this all around us now, the scarcity of workers to work in hotels, to work in transportation, to work at airports, to do medical services, food service, construction, all kinds of services. So there's lots of work for people to do that doesn't require a four-year college degree. But that doesn't mean people don't need skills. They need to be trained to do that work well and to move into those opportunities. The issue that the U.S. has in terms of jobs is we create many, many jobs, but many of those jobs use generic skill sets and therefore don't pay well, right? So if you think about a job like, babysitter, crossing guard, home health aide, these jobs are life and death matters, right? You're literally other people's hands or fate are in your hands, and yet they pay poorly. Why is that? Well, an important reason they pay poorly is because most people of sound mind and body can do that work with very limited training. Could be a crossing guard, could be a babysitter. And so because the work is not specialized, because the supply of people who can do that work is quite abundant, it's not highly paid work. So it's not enough to simply say, well, we have jobs, we have lots of jobs. You have to have the type of jobs and the type of skills that allow people to, be really productive and do something valuable that commands a higher wage in the market. You'd like to see people move out of food service and into medical services, right? You'd like to see people move out of crossing guards and do construction or the trades or skilled repair. You'd like to see actually corporations reduce some of the barriers to doing skilled work where they won't consider people who don't have a college degree and say, well, look, for computer programming or for security or tech support, maybe you don't need a college degree. Maybe you need, a foundational skill set, an analytic skill set, and then some training to be able to do that work. So a lot of our focus in the book is on the institutions, the educational institutions, the mechanisms that allow people to move up in the labor market, assuming they don't have a four-year college degree.
And one of the central ideas you sketch is that there needs to be an integration of the educational aspect with the work aspect itself. There needs to be a tight integration of actual businesses in the community and actual educational institutions in the community working with each other. You discussed that at several points. Let me just be a bit cautious on that, though. I spent, for 7 years, I was on the governing board of the Los Angeles community colleges. And I remember vividly person after person coming before the board explaining that this really was what was needed in the community colleges in order to help people to move forward. Just sitting in a classroom and absorbing material had some productivity to it, but what really helped was when you had a relationship with some local, probably fairly substantial business where people could essentially apprentice and apply themselves to the work even as they were learning it in the classroom on some other day of the week.
Absolutely. Let me just can I second that notion?
Sure. But let me throw the but. Those conversations I was having were quite a few years ago. And here's the but. It's very difficult to move institutions in a direction that they haven't been aimed at. The community college system that I'm familiar with has its set way of doing things. And to move that system is going to take a very serious determination, and simply writing a larger, call it federal budget for community colleges might not have the intended effect at all. So it's going to require a marshaling of determination to shift the direction of an existing institution in a direction that the society really needs. That's going to be hard work.
I completely agree. So let me first agree with the earlier point you made, which is that most people, but especially most adults, don't learn well in the classroom, right? The sort of disembodied knowledge, here it is on the blackboard, now go do it in the world. That's very difficult. And it's much more difficult for adults. They are busy, they're distracted, they have financial needs. They just can't go and return to being, a kind of not quite a grown-up, sitting in class all day long and trying to, focus on that. People learn better hands-on. And so that's why it's so important. Many community colleges are structured around, they're like a college, but just, with less demanding classes. That doesn't work for most people who didn't go to a four-year college. So one is education needs to be kind of immersive, engaged, ideally hands-on. And by the way, there's some hope, I hope, that technology will help us with this problem, right? That we can actually create much more effective kind of simulated learning environments, just like people do in video games, right? Where you are, kind of doing hands-on learning in a virtual setting, or even where the technology is assisting you as you work, right? So if I had, the mythical, say Google Glass, that as I'm repairing an aircraft engine or trying to fix something, I have the information displayed on the screen in front of me. That could help. That would help people. In fact, people use YouTube like this all the time, right? It's a great educational resource for people who are, doing many technically challenging jobs. The second point I want to agree with you on is it's very difficult to move these institutions. And, much as in the book we laud the German apprenticeship system, we do not propose that the U.S. adopt it. That's a very deeply ingrained system. And it's almost like saying, well, French is a better language. Why don't we speak that here? Right?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Right.
So that's why we have to figure out how to leverage the institutions that we have to do this better, right? So some of that happens, as you said, through partnerships between community colleges and businesses. We have very good examples of rigorously tested what are called sectoral training programs that basically take adults, with a certain skill set and then train them for, skilled repair, or train them for a medical paraprofession, or even train them as coders. But, those are intensive investments, and you have to have the right person who comes in with the right skills. You have to have a really good supportive training program. You have to have employers on the other end of that pipeline. And you have to have resources, not just for the education, but just support adults while they learn. People just can't stop paying their rent and feeding their kids while they're in school. And so it's a very demanding problem.
So I think the point we're making is that this is not simply an issue of expanding one educational budget or another. Yeah. It's a matter of attaching some very serious oversight and standards to what the money is going to be spent on.
Absolutely, and that's hard to do. It's very difficult in a country as large as the United States.
It becomes a much heavier political lift.
That's right.
So that's a toughie.
And, but of course we shouldn't think there's only one way we're going to go about this, right? So some of it could occur through employers changing the way they train and also whom they're willing to consider. And I'm hopeful that in this era of kind of labor scarcity and simultaneously employers realizing they need to create more opportunity for people, that they're going to change the hiring model a bit to say, maybe we don't only need to look at people with BAs from, name brand institutions. Maybe we got to look at people according to their skills rather than simply their credentials, and see who else we could get into a position to kind of move up the job ladder. Obviously, if you hire people without as many formal credentials, they're not as expensive. Maybe you can afford to invest in them a bit.
Yeah, it sounds like we're going to need the classic broad-based coalition to move forward on that. So let me turn to the second major issue you addressed, and we're really quite frank on, and that is globalization, trade, and the role of China in particular. And I have to say, in this, you have been the scholar who really, I think it's safe to say, almost invented the field of the China shock.
Well, it's really my co-authors, Gordon Hansen of the Harvard Kennedy School and David Dorn of University of Zurich, and I actually did coin that phrase in a paper, and it did.
It stuck.
It stuck. Yeah, it stuck. Anyway, but yes, we certainly that work has been influential, and we're proud of that because we think it called attention to something that was highly important and yet terribly overlooked.
It was very overlooked. Could you just give us a nugget. You really did something remarkable. You addressed the economics of the China imports in the immediate port areas where the imports were arriving. And then you did a second thing, which is to track that effect through the 2016 election.
Sure. So let me say that I could approach this from a number of angles, but let me sort of start from the kind of economics and policy orthodoxy, which is, economists are taught, I was taught, that, trade is economically a good thing because it grows the size of the pie, right? If you and I trade, right, I can do the thing I do best, you can do the thing you do best, and then we exchange for each other, we're both better off. And so the orthodoxy is, and this is correct, trade among consenting nations tends to raise GDP in all of them. And that has been the kind of wisdom that has informed, that economists have used to inform policymakers, say, look, you should always want to trade more because free trade will make you wealthier, end of story. But that's not really the end of the story. And in fact, we know this also from the economic theory, which is that trade works by changing prices. By changing the price of goods and services. And that means it changes people's wages. And some people are going to get wealthier and some people are going to get poorer depending on which prices change, right? If manufacturing goods get a lot cheaper because we're importing them from China, that means that wages of people in manufacturing are going to decline, or employment in manufacturing is going to decline. And so even though the pie is larger, it's the case that some slices are smaller. So trade is redistributive.
So in America, I can get a Chinese import of a television or a utensil at a much reduced price, and consumers across the entire United States are benefited. But folks making those products close to the locations where the Chinese imports actually come in, ta-da.
Right. So what we show is it's not so much the geography of where the imports occur, but where the things would have been produced in the United States. So when the U.S. starts importing lots of tires or commodity furniture or assembled electronics or tools, those compete with the same products that would have been made in the United States. And the end result is when things change very fast, as they did after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, we see kind of the collapse of localized industries, of furniture manufacturing, of the textile industry, of a lot of assembly, and medium pay manufacturing work, typically in the South, some in the West, some in the Northeast, and that created real consumer benefits. There's no question that we all have better access to toys and hardware and many things more convenient because of that. But the benefits were broadly shared, but they're small on average. But the costs were very concentrated and felt very strongly in those areas where industry collapsed, where you had plants that made over 1,000 workers making furniture. All of a sudden, they're gone, and that led to not only declines in manufacturing, but overall falls in employment rates in those areas, declines in household incomes, increases in child poverty, reductions in fertility, decline in marriage, and other associated ills. And so those scars were deep. They didn't heal quickly. In many ways, they still have not healed. And policymakers weren't paying close attention to that, in part because the orthodoxy sort of said, well, everybody wins.
But what happened in 2016?
Well, so we in one paper, we provide evidence that the trade shock contributed both to the rise of kind of the Tea Party Republicans and eventually to the election of Donald Trump. Now, I want to emphasize that there are many contributing factors. It's not if there hadn't been a China shock, there'd still quite plausibly be a Donald Trump. and throughout the rest of the industrialized world, we see lots of similar political movements. So I don't want to say that the China shock is uniquely responsible for that. It's not. It was another major irritant to the body politic in the place where it was already inflamed, in creating a sense that the economy was working for one group of people and not for another, and it was devaluing and reducing opportunities in blue collar work, and benefiting the educated, well-educated business class who benefit from I mean, I get lots of goods and services more cheaply because of China, and yet I'm not competing for my job with any Chinese worker, right? I'm protected from trade, but I'm a beneficiary of it.
Well, here we are now, 2022. China has been in the World Trade Organization for a little over 20 years. And the history that I keep reading in the literature is it's violation after violation after violation. I found myself thinking they literally must have sat down and said, what are all the things we can violate? And decided we're going to do them all. So China has really been a bad player in the WTO. What could we do about that?
Yeah, so it hasn't worked out as hoped. So first, I want to emphasize it's really important, and I'm sure your readers, your listeners will agree with me. China's rise per se has been, in many ways, a fantastic thing for humanity. It has built the world middle class. Not only has it brought hundreds of millions of Chinese out of abject poverty, but it's created prosperity in Central and South America. It's created investment in sub-Saharan Africa. So this has been overall a very good thing. And made many people's lives much, much, much better. However, from the narrow perspective of the United States, the hope was that by bringing China into WTO, it would so-called reform and open. It would we'd bring it into the Western fold, and it would choose to play by the same rules, and it would democratize, it would open up, and we would see each other much more as strategic partners. This obviously has not occurred according to plan. On one level, China hasn't been a very good player by the rules of WTO in a variety of ways, through subsidizing products and dumping them for strategic reasons, like solar cells and so on, and another by blocking entry of competitors from abroad. So it's not been a great player by the rules of WTO, but even more importantly, probably, it is not democratized or westernized. It's become much more a strategic adversary. So I don't think, and that was not the hope, right? The hope of the people who negotiated China's WTO accession was they had some sense that this could cause some disruption, this could cause some frictions, this could cause some hardship. They weren't completely blind to that possibility, but they said, well, in the long run, it'll be worth it because it's going to change the trajectory. It's going to help fortify the kind of Western democratic project. And I don't think anyone could. They weren't right, but I don't think there was any way to know that back then. I'm not sure what we would have done differently if we had known. Then one thing we might have done somewhat differently is had this WTO, this China's trade integration go more slowly and with more kind of guardrails. That would have been
much better. The thing that strikes me is in 2001, China was a dictatorship run by the Communist Party, but it was run by a cadre of the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, starting in 2013 with the advent of the rise of Xi Jinping. That's over. Rather than democratizing, it seems to me and to a whole lot of other folks that China has dramatically moved in the opposite direction into a one-person dictatorship akin to Mao or akin to Stalin.
I mean, there's no question that China has, become less democratic over the last 10 years. There's much more censorship, control of the media. The takeover of Hong Kong was that. It's become more bellicose, less transparent, and less tolerant of internal as well as external dissent. And also its economic policies have changed a lot. It's actually less pro-market than it was. There's been much more government redirection of resources out of the private sector and towards state-owned enterprises. And
that, again, is in the Xi Jinping era.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, some of this started under Hu Jintao, but Xi Jinping has, really ramped this up, and he is a kind of a strongman figure, the type that we don't see that often, who really kind of organizes an entire country around his personality. People in China call him the chairman of everything.
We should point out that in November of this year, the Chinese Party will have its 20th Party Congress once every 5 years. And it's anticipated that at that Party Congress, Xi Jinping will be anointed for yet another term, which will shatter every convention by which China has had been ruled for decades. And he will establish himself, God only knows for how long.
For sure. Yeah, that is the expectation. I think it's important to sort of bear in mind, it's hard to imagine a situation where another country became as rich as China has, as powerful as it has, without there being global tensions around that, right? When empires rise and empires fall, it's usually not pretty, right? And so it's hard to believe that China could achieve what it achieved and not have people in the U.S. rather nervous about that, not have that be threatening to the sort of system of alliances and expectations and norms that we have set up, especially in the Second War era. So this is not all Xi Jinping, and this is not all bad faith on China's part. Some of this is, would have to happen. But I do think the direction of China under Xi Jinping has been one that many Westerners, including myself, look on with a great deal of alarm, because it's much more militaristic, it's much less democratic, involves much more control of information and citizenship and squashing of dissent than I'm comfortable with, to put it mildly.
Let me turn to your third basket. We discussed technology, we discussed trade, focusing on China. And the third basket you focus on is U.S. institutions. You look primarily at minimum wage and the state of American unions. Flesh that out for us.
Sure. So, one of the figures that we have in the book that I think kind of illustrates the point we're making about the diversity of institutions and how much they matter is we compare the kind of purchasing power adjusted earnings of people in kind of low education service jobs. You can think of these as the McDonald's jobs. And in the US, a worker at that type of job would earn about $10 an hour, as in 2015. The same worker in, let's say, Norway or Denmark would make $20-something an hour. Now, you might say, come on, don't compare us to Scandinavia. That's another planet. That's so annoying. Everybody hates that. That's fine. I understand that. But compare us to Canada, where that same worker working at Tim Hortons instead of McDonald's is making $14 an hour rather than $10 an hour. It's very unlikely that that worker at Tim Hortons in Canada is 30% more productive than the U.S. worker. Extremely unlikely. Why are they paid so differently? That's an institutional choice, right? So Canada is a very convenient point of comparison because not only do they share landmass with us, they speak the same language, and they have many, many similar institutions. And yet there are these big differences in inequality, especially the quality of jobs for people at the bottom of the economic ladder. In none of these countries is a fast food worker a high-paid worker by the standards of that country. But the quality of work, the economic security, and the benefits that go along with that in terms of paid vacation, access to health care, medical leave, are so much better than the United States. So we point that out not to, just cast a jaundiced eye at the U.S., but to point out that there's lots of room to do better, that it's people often jump to the conclusion, well, that's just the market. That's the market pay. The market dictates. We must do what the market says. Not recognizing our agency. Of course, the market matters. These are all mixed market economies. They're all economies that do a lot of, trade in markets. A lot of things are marketized, but they also have governments. They also have tax systems. They also have rules and regulations. They have norms. And so we point out two institutions in the United States that I don't think these are, in some sense, the keys, but they are important. One is the minimum wage. The U.S. minimum wage is at the federal minimum wage in real terms at the same level now as it was in 1950, which is insane. You expect at a minimum it would rise at least at the rate of, I don't know, if it were to rise at the rate of, average productivity or something, that would be something. But it's basically stagnated. It sort of says, look, that if you're working in a low-paid job in the U.S. economy, you should expect to earn the same thing as someone did in 1950, even though the country's twice as rich. Right? That's amazing. And minimum wages do matter a great deal. There's a lot of evidence now that not only did they raise wages as they're supposed to, they have very little measurable cost in terms of lost jobs, lost employment. And that's been a kind of revolution in the literature showing this. Part of the reason that David Card received the Nobel Prize in Economics just last year was for his kind of work just kind of documenting this very unexpected but very powerful and robust fact. Another thing that has been so consequential in the United States has been the decline of collective bargaining. And, U.S., in the private sector now, I think about 7% of all workers are covered by a union contract. If you include the public sector, it's much higher. That's a different animal. This is much, much lower than almost all of the, lower than in Canada, lower than in continental Europe. It's only a little bit higher in the UK. And unions have pluses and minuses, right? We all know that there can be a lot of strife, that unions can make counterproductive demands. They can make companies uncompetitive in theory. But on the other hand, not having a voice for workers, especially in 4 decades of a very deregulatory environment, has meant that most of the benefits, most of the gains in productivity have just been channeled upward, not to rank and file workers, but to managers, to owners, right? And this contributes to inequality. And so there is nothing good that has stepped in the place of declining unions to represent workers and to negotiate to see that, some of the productivity and profit gains are shared. And I think that's a very, very serious problem for the United States. So those two are the two institutions we call attention to, alongside, of course, the educational institutions, in pointing out the kind of ossification and decay of U.S. institutions. It is an amazing fact that the U.S. has kind of the best environmental and labor and safety institutions of around 1965, and civil rights too. We were so far ahead of the world in all those areas. And then the rest of the world kind of caught up with us and then kept advancing incrementally in those realms. And the U.S. has basically fought a trench war over the last 4 or 5 decades, where one side fights to keep those things in place, another fights to erode them, and the net result is they just stay in place. We haven't updated our labor standards. We haven't updated our overtime standards. We haven't, raised the minimum wage meaningfully, or we raise it and then it falls again because of inflation. So that is, we think that is a major malfunction that has worked against the interests of the majority of American workers.
So we've discussed technology and trade, and we discussed several institutions in the United States which are in atrophy and need work. Let me discuss with you one overarching question we haven't touched on, and that works this way. When you stop and look at the problem that MIT was facing and that you sketched with workers' pay and the atrophy of the middle class and middle income jobs in the country, there's a strand that says, well, this is all about money. Too many people are not earning enough money. Let's simply establish welfare programs that transfer money to people. That will solve the problem. We can tax the rich, take the money away, turn it over to other folks in one or another program, and that will do the job. You've written with your colleagues an entire book and devoted to work and making work pay much better and support individuals' lives. Why is work important?
That's an excellent question. And you're right, it's kind of built into our book. We never even tell about why we focus on work. We just focus on work. I think they're kind of, I give you 2 answers. Let me start with the kind of probably less compelling answer, but still important to me. I think work is quite important. I think work isn't just the thing you do, that unpleasant thing you do for pay so you can go home and enjoy yourself. Work provides meaning, structure, identity, purpose, esteem. It provides a community. It hopefully provides, friends. It's part of the kind of productive project of many people's lives. That doesn't mean everyone should be compelled to work, but work is a good. Work is not a bad. In economic models, work is that bad thing you do to get the money so you can enjoy yourself after work. But in reality, many people, work is much, much more meaningful than that. So I think work is a great social institution. I don't want to see it go away. The second is the alternatives look much less good. We can talk all day long about how it would be, we have so much money, why don't we redistribute it from the rich to the poor? But the truth is, everybody hates redistribution, not just the rich. And I'll tell you why. The rich don't like being taxed. Of course, no one likes being taxed. But people don't like receiving their pay in the form of a check from the government to say, sorry about your crappy job, but here's your compensation, right? I would like to be, they want to be paid for the work they do because it's valuable, not because they are, in some sense, unlucky, right? And so a system that depends on taxing the wealthy to support everybody else, and everybody understands that as a transfer from one group to the other, is not politically viable over the long term. And in fact, this is not an elitist perspective. If you look at surveys of blue collar adults, they like unions, they like minimum wages, they don't like the welfare system, they don't love the disability system, they don't like the notion of getting government checks to compensate for things they lost, right? What a lot of people are clamoring for is, we would like the world back where a blue collar worker could have a middle class lifestyle, and that was a stable, viable phenomenon, a way of organizing life that we could look forward to, as opposed to one where if we don't have a college education, our work is precarious, our pay is uncertain, our health care may or may not be available, and there's no one representing us at our work, right? So I think we need to think about using the labor market as a way to address these economic challenges rather than hoping to fix them ex post through taxing and transferring.
Well, I want to thank you for your insights on that and ask a very difficult question of you. That here we are in 2022, and I listen to the political environment around me. Plenty of conversation about politics, plenty of conversation about which direction the country should go, but most of it seems to revolve around, if not Donald Trump in particular, around one or another identity politics issue. Social justice issues, and the Republican Party and the Democratic Party define themselves on where they are on a whole variety of social justice issues. You're talking about something very different than that. How do you build a movement to further the agenda you have sketched?
Yeah, it's a very hard question, and I'm not, that's not the realm I work in. I don't consider myself to be expert in it. I mean, I do think, I obviously have take very strong objection to a lot of things that are happening on the right in terms of issues, many, many issues. But let me say, the one thing that does animate, and the one positive thing that Trump identified was a sense that blue collar workers, the average Joe, are getting a raw deal, and that the system is working not to their advantage. Trade would be one emblem of that, but in general, the whole structure of work and organization. Now, Trump unfortunately didn't do anything about those. In fact, arguably he made it worse. But there is a sense that even the Republican Party is much, much less hostile to labor and to working class folks than it used to be. But I don't think so what we really need is a synthesis, or kind of coming together of people who respect and understand the value of work, view that from the perspective not of the highly educated people in Silicon Valley, not that there's anything wrong with them, they're my friends, it's all great what they're doing, but they don't need our help. But from the perspective of people who, the vast majority of adult Americans who do not have a college degree and want to have a stable, middle-class life with some security and an opportunity for their children to succeed. That's, and I think there's a lot of shared sentiment around that. It doesn't translate well into our politics. We are poorly represented. I don't think either of our parties, and certainly the way they interact, allows us to get what people want. I don't think that the laws that we get are in some sense representative of the people who elected those lawmakers. You can see that in gun control, you can see that in abortion, you can see that in tax policy, you can see that in minimum wage. The country loves the minimum wage. Every state that puts it on the ballot, it passes. But it doesn't happen at the federal level. Why not? That's a political malfunction, right? So I think the country and people are much more reasonable than the political parties, and much better than the collective thing they produce as a result of their work. So I don't know how we get there, but I think there's more commonality of desire and shared sense of what is a reasonable way to organize the country than is reflected in the laws and policies that we're making.
Well, I want to thank you for your realism and your combined optimism along those lines. I share your optimism in the people. I have a tremendous amount of faith in the American public and the wisdom that the American public has. And I certainly wish your ideas well.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having this conversation. Thank you for your close read of the book, and I admire the work that you've done as well. And obviously that's what gives you the capabilities to engage so thoughtfully on these topics. So it's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thanks again. It's great to stay in touch. Bye-bye. David Autor brings us bad news, very bad news, and then brings us some much-needed good news. The bad news is that our middle class is in deep, deep trouble. Since the late 1970s, middle-class incomes have been stagnant, while the upper class is flourishing, funded by acquiring just about all of the nation's growing productivity. Today, even having a college degree no longer brings security. Security was a hallmark of the middle class. Today's college graduates were told, study hard, get good grades, obey the rules, keep your nose clean, graduate from college, and you'll do well. You'll be secure. Now, too many college graduates find themselves stuck paying rent in apartments they can barely afford. Buy your own single-family house? Forget about it. That's an American dream stuck in the past. Wake up. They were lied to, and they're pissed. The old left of the 1970s was angry at their country because it was waging an unjust war. The anger of today's youth is personal. Their country has abandoned them. My guess is that it is this group, recent college graduates now stuck in crummy apartments and sick of the establishment lies, that form the core of the new socialist movement in the country. Before the 1970s, the divide between the rich and poor in America was being closed by a rising and thriving middle class. America was becoming more equal. It was a growing equality that came right out of the paychecks of tens of millions of Americans. It was an equality that was earned at work, and middle-class Americans were proud of their earned equality. I think of the famous poster of Rosie the Riveter, hair pulled back by her kerchief, looking directly at you and pulling back her sleeve to show her strong bicep. Powerful and proud. A vision out of a completely different world than ours. For me, saving our middle class is important for two very different reasons. The first one is obvious. Most of us are middle class, or are struggling to stay middle class, or aspiring to be middle class. A middle class in trouble means for folks in the middle that they are threatened and frightened. The world is slipping out of their grasp. And for those at the bottom, it means that they are literally trapped. But I also see a second reason, a foundational reason. When the middle class was earning its way toward greater social power in the 1950s and 60s, was it sheer accident that our society also saw an optimistic blossoming of the American civil rights movement, the birth of the environmental movement, and a second birth of the feminist movement? And was it sheer coincidence that when the middle class ceased to thrive around the late 1970s, when it became frightened, insecure, worried about its future, when it became convinced its kids could never expect to have the life of their parents, that in those times the social movements that had emerged began to stumble and stall? The stagnation of our middle class has given birth to an era of stagnant politics. A secure middle class had provided the foundations for optimistic social movements. Instead, borrowing Autor's words, a kind of trench warfare has set in. One side struggles to maintain what it had achieved, the other side fights to retake lost ground, and the end result is stalemate. Without a thriving middle class, we are all just fighting over scraps, and our politics has become a zero-sum game. But enough with the pessimism. That is not Autor's important message. After all that bad news, Autor is an optimist. The good news is we don't have to accept that our middle class is in terminal decline. We can fix it. We can save our middle class. But it will take some very heavy political lifting. At a minimum, says Autor, we will have to raise the minimum wage and massively improve our educational system. But Autor's distinctive contribution is to argue that expanding the number of college graduates is not the educational change we need. What is needed is a huge improvement in the skills of tens of millions of us who will never set foot in a four-year college. That will require creating bridges between community colleges and local businesses and involves a real transformation of how we have thought about education in our society. Looking at our laws about labor, Autor points out that without a reinvigorated union movement pressing businesses to share the fruits of growing productivity with their workers, we will continue to see the vast majority of those fruits flowing upward. And he says the entire field of labor legislation needs to be updated after 7 decades of stagnation. Turning to international trade, my own view, not speaking for David Autor, is that we will eventually be forced to find ways to require China to become a much more honest participant. Each of these is a very heavy lift by itself. Together, they are a project for years of effort. To maintain that effort, we, the nation, will have to make the fate of the middle class our paramount concern. But today we hear the Democratic Republican parties contending on a host of other issues, on abortion, on sex, on health care, on immigration, on social justice, on climate change, on crime, even on college student debt. Each party has its vision on those issues and argues that its vision is the better one. Do we hear them contending on how to save our middle class? Is there even a coherent Democratic Party or Republican Party platform on that? Can we list the disagreements of the parties on what should be done? The silence is deafening. Instead of dealing with the most important issue of our times, a foundational issue, both political parties are silent because they're out of ideas, stuck in their rigid ideologies. Here at the Political Conversation, we will not be silent. Despite the silence of the two parties, there are plenty of ideas from many different political perspectives on what we should be doing to revive our middle class. We began exploring those ideas with David Autor, and we will explore those ideas further. I wonder where you stand. What do you really think about the fate of our middle class? You can always reach me at wally@thepoliticalconversation.org. In our coming podcast, I will sit down with Daron Acemoglu, a colleague of Autor's at MIT. Acemoglu has some genuinely new ideas about how the bias against work in our tax system has led to the decline of the middle class, and he thinks he knows what to do about it. For today, my thanks to David Autor for sharing his thoughts and his very real concerns with us. His new book, The Work of the Future, with co-authors David Mindell and Elizabeth Reynolds, packs into 140 pages many more ideas than we had time to cover and is an absolutely essential read. As always, my thanks to my producer Anna Kumu for her excellent work. If you found this interesting, maybe even if it ticked you off, remember to subscribe. Be sure to listen on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review it, and you can also turn on your friends to what is happening in the political conversation. I'll see you next time on The Political Conversation.